North America doesn't have the best reputation for walkability and transit, but its biggest deficiency is arguably in cycling. We've inherited a lot of fundamentally walkable neighborhoods, and even built some decent rapid transit systems in the past 50 years. But progress on bike culture and infrastructure has been slower and more piecemeal, especially cycling for transportation as opposed to recreation or exercise. But exactly how high do rates of cycling go, and what do the more bike-friendly neighborhoods look like? In this video, we're going to look at the top 10 zip codes for bike commuting in the US, setting aside Canada for the moment because the data isn't quite comparable. The 10th highest bike commuting rate in the US is this zip code covering the northern half of Columbia Heights in Washington, D.C., where 9.4% of commuters get to work or school by bike. This is a medium-density neighborhood near Howard University. This zip code has moderate coverage for bike lanes, most of which are narrow painted lanes, but close to the university there are a few recent corridors that look quite nice. One went from 3 lanes for cars in 2019 to giving up one of those lanes for a 2-way parking protected bike lane in 2022. The other went from a painted bike lane/parking spot in 2021 to a narrow but pretty well protected lane in 2022 that also features bollards at intersections. This neighborhood can be pretty hilly, but benefits from having narrower streets and likely slower cars. The 9th highest rate of bike commuting is this zip code covering the northwestern corner of Fort Collins, Colorado, around Colorado State University, where 9.6% of people commute by bike. In contrast to the compact urban neighborhood that we just saw in DC, this is a much more spread out suburban area bordering on rural. The bike lanes have pretty good coverage but are mostly just painted, although some are buffered and we also see some modal filters. By the way, we're measuring cycling as a percentage of all commutes, excluding work from home. Most US data includes remote work as a commuting method, but it feels like a different category because it's not actually a commute. Maybe we're biased because the Canadian census treats it separately. The 8th highest rate of bike commuting is this zip code southeast of Center City in Philadelphia, where 9.9% of commuters bike to work or school. This is another dense urban neighborhood with lots of smaller side streets. There aren't as many bike routes as in Fort Collins, but the ones that do exist are better quality with more separation. There's a nice separated pathway near the water that didn't exist as recently as 2019. And this main road went from pretty awful in 2019 to much better a few years later. The 7th highest rate of bike commuting is this weirdly shaped zip code covering Menlo Park, a suburb in the San Francisco Bay Area, where 10.2% of commuters bike to work or school. The actual zip code itself has okay coverage with painted bike lanes, some better than others, but it's next to Stanford University, which in a lot of areas looks like a cyclist paradise, including this really nice cross-campus road dedicated to cyclists, and maybe buses too. When you look at how much bike parking there is around Stanford, it's pretty clear that the university is driving a lot of the bike commuting in this neighboring zip code. At number 6, we have the zip code covering Key West, Florida, where 10.4% of commuters use a bike. We visited Miami recently and loved the aesthetic, but found a lot of the road design and car culture to be very hostile to pedestrians. Some people suggested that we should visit Key West next time, and it looks like they're right. While there are some highways with sharrows that give us flashbacks to Miami, that looks to be the exception rather than the rule. There are pathways, painted bike lanes, and in general it's a compact place with narrow streets that work well for people on bikes. It's also just a place where you see a lot of bikes parked as you explore around in Street View. Number 5 is a zip code covering the Mission District in San Francisco, where 10.5% of people bike to work. This area is mainly covered by painted bike lanes, in some better and some worse environments. It's also the site of the infamous Valencia Street corridor with the unconventional center-running bike lane. Number 4 is a zip code in Cambridge, Massachusetts, covering the MIT campus and almost going to Harvard, where 10.6% of commuters bike to work or school. This area has some of the nicest bike lanes we've seen so far, and although the coverage is piecemeal, lasting a few blocks before turning into painted lanes again, they clearly seem to know what they're doing here. There are even some hints of Dutch-style protected intersections. Number 3 is a zip code in Isla Vista, California, basically an extension of Santa Barbara, where 11% of people bike to work or school. This zip code includes the University of California, Santa Barbara, which, like Stanford, seems to be a bit of a bicycle paradise on campus. There's a ton of bike parking with pretty amazing bike path coverage and limited car access. We can't even get Google Street View shots of all the bike paths because so much of it is separate from the road network, but there are cycling underpasses and roundabouts and everything. Off-campus definitely isn't as bike-friendly, with some terrifying bike routes, but there are some pretty great separated or off-road bike connections too, some with underpasses. There are also some roads with a separated bike route running parallel to a painted bike lane. Not sure of the intention there. Number 2 is back to the Boston area for a zip code in Somerville, Massachusetts, where 13.9% of commuters use a bike. Similar to nearby Cambridge, Somerville has some of the best protected bike infrastructure that we've seen in North America. They're even working on some protected intersections too, although again there are ups and downs. Like Philadelphia, it does help here that most of the roads aren't all that wide or fast. And the number 1 top zip code for bike commuting covers the west side of Davis, California, a few hours from San Francisco, which has by far the highest rate of bike commuting on this list, 23.5%. Davis is a university town, with students and faculty from UC Davis making up a pretty big percentage of the population. Davis is interesting for bike infrastructure because it has really good coverage, with bike routes that range from awesome to okay. It helps that the city is small, but the bike network seems to cover every neighborhood and most major corridors in a way that we've never seen from a North American city. You can get everywhere with bike routes in a way that we're jealous of. The actual routes themselves are not always amazing. Lots of painted lanes, albeit often buffered for some extra breathing room. But where it's good, it's really good, especially though not only near the university. Well-separated pathways, cycling and pedestrian underpasses, roundabouts, modal filters. There's a new student and staff housing development called West Village, where many of the buildings open onto car-free pathways and have courtyards built around bike parking. And those were the top 10 zip codes for bike commuting in the United States, based on the 2022 5-year American Community Survey. One of the big caveats to all of this is that there's a pretty big margin of error, so aside from Davis being a clear winner, don't take the rankings as being exact. Whether a neighborhood got 9.4% as opposed to 10.2% isn't really that meaningful. Understand these as basically a group of the highest cycling neighborhoods, with one clear winner. So what did we learn from this top 10? First, cycling is still relatively marginal. With the exception of Davis, the numbers we saw here were not that high, both compared to more bike-friendly countries, but even compared to public transit in the US. Most North American cities, especially bigger ones, move more people by transit than by cycling. On the optimistic side, setting aside Davis, none of these places had amazing bike networks. If 10 to 12% cycling is what you can achieve with moderately good infrastructure, imagine what you'd get with really good bike infrastructure across these cities. And some of these places really looked like they were heading in that direction. Philadelphia, Cambridge, and Somerville all had pretty nice routes that were installed relatively recently, which makes you hopeful that they're going to keep improving. Another positive point is that there was a lot of diversity in these cycling successes. It wasn't just mild climates like California, it was also warmer climates like Florida and colder climates like the Northeast. It wasn't just big, dense cities like San Francisco or Philadelphia, but also smaller, more suburban ones like Fort Collins and Davis. We also had hilly environments in San Francisco and DC. This variety goes completely against the most common argument against urban cycling, which is to suggest that it's only practical in a very narrow set of urban environments or climates. Basically, according to a lot of cycling critics, bikes just aren't practical unless you have the exact same climate, history, and density as the Netherlands. Seriously, it seems like people aren't that far off saying something like, "You can't bike here, we don't have canals." One pessimistic interpretation, though, is that most of the cycling success stories had a major university presence nearby. Students tend to be less able to afford cars, maybe more concerned with the environment, and more likely to be physically fit. A critic could point out that cycling success is harder among a non-student population, and that's probably true. On the other hand, it's not just about the students themselves. Some of these universities, especially in California, do a really good job of making their campuses bike-friendly. What if municipalities were as interested as universities in creating attractive, people-friendly, low-stress environments? Thanks for watching through to the end of the video. Don't forget to bike and subscribe, and a special thanks to our supporters on Patreon.